In the early 18th century, the British colony of Virginia in North America was a prosperous land of vast plantations and a rigidly stratified society. Here, a wealthy class of landowners thrived on tobacco cultivation and enslaved labor, while political authority remained tightly bound to Great Britain. It was in this setting that a child was born, one who would later become one of the most remarkable figures in American history: George Washington. George Washington was born on the 22nd of February 1732, the 11th of February 1731, under the old calendar, at Pope's Creek Plantation in Westmoreland County, Virginia. The Washington family belonged to the well-to-do planter class. His father, Augustine Washington, owned extensive tobacco fields, a blacksmith shop, and dozens of enslaved workers. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was Augustine's second wife. Before marrying Mary, Augustine had been married once and had two sons, Lawrence and Augustine Jr., and one daughter from his first marriage. He was hardworking and successful, but his first wife passed away at a young age. In 1731, he remarried Mary Ball, an orphan from a modest background, but known for her strong will and deep religious faith. George was the eldest of the 6 children. Augustine and Mary would have together. One daughter passed away in infancy, so George grew up with 4 younger siblings in the household. When George was about 3 years old, his father purchased a vast new property of several thousand acres along the beautiful Potomac River. The family moved there. It would later be known as Mount Vernon, forever associated with Washington's name. In 1738, George's half-brother Lawrence, about 20 years old and newly returned from his studies in England, rejoined the family in Virginia. For the first time, 6-year-old George met his much older brother, who was 14 years his senior. Shortly after Lawrence returned, Augustine entrusted him with managing the newly acquired Mount Vernon estate, along with roughly 2,000 surrounding acres. Augustine, Mary, and their younger children moved back to the family's older property, Ferry Farm, near Fredericksburg, on the Rappahannock River. This meant George was once again separated from his older brother he had only just begun to know. The decision to give Lawrence the most valuable property reflected the British inheritance customs of the time, in which the eldest son typically received the principal share of the estate. Tragedy struck the family not long afterward. In April 1743, when George was 11, his father passed away suddenly. Mary Ball Washington, widowed at 36, was left to raise 5 young children, George and his siblings, ranging roughly from ages 5 to 11. For the Washington family, this was both a sorrowful and challenging turning point. From this moment on, young George had to shoulder significant responsibilities. As the eldest son still living at home, his 2 half-brothers were adults living independently, he became the main support for his mother and siblings. He helped Mary manage Ferry Farm, overseeing tobacco cultivation, supervising the blacksmith shop, and tending to the fields, livestock, and general farm work. Mary, known for her strictness and resilience, instilled in George discipline, responsibility, and deep moral grounding. His father's passing also meant George lost the opportunity to study in England like his older half-brothers. Instead, he continued his education at a local school in Fredericksburg until about age 15, when his formal schooling ended. Although he lacked the higher education awarded to boys sent abroad, George nurtured an intense desire for knowledge and devoted himself to self-study. He was especially drawn to mathematics and surveying. Some of the geometric exercises he carefully copied as a youth are preserved today at the Mount Vernon estate, proof of his dedication to learning. Alongside academic subjects, the young Washington devoted himself to cultivating moral character and proper conduct. Between the ages of 14 and 16, George painstakingly copied all 110 rules of civility and decent behavior, a guide for young gentlemen, adapted from a French text. These rules taught him how to speak politely, behave with courtesy, maintain proper table manners, navigate social situations, show respect to all, and preserve a clear conscience. By copying and memorizing each rule, George developed poise, self-control, and discipline from an early age. Alongside these lessons, American folklore later popularized a charming anecdote about Washington's honesty. According to the tale, when George was 6, he accidentally chopped down his father's prized cherry tree with a small hatchet. When his father asked who caused the damage, the boy bravely confessed, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. I did it." Though historians today believe the story is a myth created later, rather than a factual event, the image of the young Washington, who could not tell a lie, has become a symbolic part of American popular culture. As a teenager, George once considered testing his ambitions at sea. In 1746, when he was only 14, his family contemplated arranging for him to join the British Royal Navy, an exciting prospect for a young man eager to make his mark. In fact, nearly all the arrangements had been completed for George to board a ship, but at the last moment, Mary Washington firmly opposed the plan. She feared the dangers and hardships her son might face across distant oceans, and she could not bear the thought of parting with him. Respecting his mother's wishes, George abandoned the dream of a naval career. In hindsight, it was likely this decision to remain in Virginia that allowed him to embark later on a distinguished military career on land, rather than becoming an unknown naval officer aboard a British warship. Washington's childhood and teenage years were not solely filled with study and farm work. He also showed early talent in horseback riding and hunting, skills common among the gentry of the time. George grew quickly into a tall, strong young man. He would eventually reach nearly 6 feet 2 inches as an adult. At around age 11 or 12, he began accompanying his older half-brother Lawrence on fox hunting excursions with members of the influential Fairfax family. The quiet boy astonished everyone. Although still small enough that the horse's saddle seemed high on him, George rode with remarkable skill, galloping effortlessly through forests. His aim was so precise that he seemed to hit every target cleanly, bringing down swift foxes with ease. His impressive marksmanship and riding ability earned him admiration and respect among Virginia's elite. Around age 14, George finally received a horse of his own, and even a young enslaved servant assigned to him. At that time, owning a personal horse was considered a marker of maturity and status within the family. From then on, George Washington's image was inseparable from horseback riding. Throughout his entire life, he remained an exceptional horseman. From his youthful adventures across rugged terrain to his legendary military campaigns, and even during his presidency, when he rode daily around his Mount Vernon estate. A major influence shaping George's future was the guidance of his half-brother Lawrence Washington and the Fairfax family. Although much older, Lawrence was deeply close to George. After their father's passing, he became not just an older brother, but a mentor and supporter. Lawrence himself was talented and ambitious. He joined the Virginia militia in 1739 and later served alongside the British Royal Navy in the conflict between Britain and Spain in the Caribbean. He traveled as far as Cuba and Jamaica before returning home in 1742. Thanks to his military experience and the family's respected reputation, Lawrence was appointed by the governor of Virginia as commander of the militia in his district. In the summer of 1743, not long after their father passed away, Lawrence married Anne Fairfax, a young woman from the illustrious Fairfax family. The Fairfax lineage was the only one in Virginia at the time to hold a noble title granted by the British Crown. They owned more than 50,000 acres of land and wielded significant political influence. Fairfax County, Virginia, still bears their name. The marriage greatly strengthened Lawrence's social standing. With his father-in-law's support, he was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, and together they helped establish the Ohio Company, aiming to open trade routes along the Potomac River toward the western frontier. Lawrence also worked tirelessly to transform Mount Vernon into a grand estate befitting the Virginia gentry. For young George, frequent visits to Mount Vernon during his teenage years immersed him in the refined world of the Fairfax family. He observed and learned the manners and etiquette of the aristocracy, from formal dinners to discussions of politics and current affairs. Colonel William Fairfax, Lawrence's father-in-law, grew especially fond of George. He once wrote to Mary Washington, praising her for raising such an exceptional son. In his eyes, George was remarkably self-disciplined, calm, and mature for his age. These hunts, conversations, and interactions with the well-educated Fairfax elders exposed George to military matters, politics, and valuable social connections. With guidance and encouragement from this influential family, George Washington's path in life began to open. In 1748, at just 16, George Washington received his first major opportunity thanks to the Fairfax family. Lord Thomas Fairfax, William's cousin, needed surveyors to map the boundaries of his immense landholdings in the Shenandoah Valley of western Virginia. George was invited to join the surveying team. Full of energy, the young Washington rode out alongside experienced surveyors. They crossed rugged mountains, followed winding streams, drove stakes into the ground, and sketched maps under harsh, natural conditions. Life in the wilderness was both challenging and dangerous. At night, the group slept under the stars or in makeshift tents. Meals were uncertain. The days were spent trudging through mud and rain, avoiding wild animals, and at times staying cautious of unfamiliar indigenous groups. Yet George never wavered. He adapted quickly and displayed impressive endurance, courage, and resilience. The expedition was a success and gave George invaluable experience. The following year, in 1749, at age 17, he was officially appointed county surveyor of Culpeper County, a prestigious and well-paid post for someone so young, especially a young man without formal higher education. For the next several years, Washington traveled constantly across Virginia's frontier, mapping forests, ridges, and river valleys. The profession not only provided him with financial independence, but also allowed him to begin accumulating property. With the wages he earned, he purchased his first parcels of land in the Shenandoah Valley, laying the foundation for the vast land holdings he would acquire later in life. More importantly, his years as a surveyor shaped him into a perceptive and worldly young man. Seasoned by direct experience, he became intimately familiar with the geography of the frontier, formed relationships with native peoples, and learned survival skills in remote wilderness. Few young planters in Virginia at the time possessed such practical knowledge of the backcountry as George Washington did, and soon all these abilities and insights would serve him well on the military path that awaited him. The next major turning point in Washington's life came in the early 1750s, when the clouds of conflict began to gather over the Virginia frontier. At the time, both the British Empire and France coveted the vast Ohio River Valley to the west. The British, represented by the colonial government of Virginia and by the Ohio Company, in which Lawrence played a leading role, wanted to expand westward for land and trade. Meanwhile, the French, moving down from Canada, quietly built a chain of forts to link their territory to Louisiana, determined to prevent the British from seizing this strategically vital region. What began as silent competition soon escalated into open confrontation. In 1751, Lawrence Washington fell seriously ill with tuberculosis. George accompanied his brother all the way to Barbados in the Caribbean, hoping the tropical climate might restore Lawrence's health. It was Washington's first and only trip outside North America. Ironically, during their stay, George contracted a severe case of smallpox. After a difficult illness, he eventually recovered. As a result, he gained lifelong immunity to the disease, though his face retained a few faint scars. Lawrence, however, did not improve. The brothers returned to Virginia, and shortly afterward, in July 1752, Lawrence passed away at the age of 34. The loss of his elder brother was a profound blow for George. Along with the emotional pain, Lawrence's absence left a significant gap in the family's estate and social standing. Responsibilities George now began to assume. Lawrence had no surviving son, his only daughter had passed away in early childhood, so according to his will, the Mount Vernon estate would eventually pass to George. In practice, George first managed the property temporarily or leased it from Lawrence's widow. He would inherit it formally only years later, after she also passed away. Even more consequential was the position Lawrence left vacant. He had served as commander of the militia in one of Virginia's districts. After his death, Governor Robert Dinwiddie reorganized the colony's entire militia into 4 districts, each led by a commanding officer. Thanks to his family's reputation and his own demonstrated abilities, 21-year-old George Washington was appointed by Dinwiddie in February 1753 as one of these 4 officers, with the rank of major. This appointment marked Washington's official entry into military life. The decision came at a critical moment, as tensions in the Ohio Valley were rising quickly. In 1753, the French intensified their military activities in the region, constructing more forts to assert their claims. Governor Dinwiddie, acting on orders from the British government, was instructed to demand that the French withdraw from lands that the British considered part of Virginia. A high-stakes diplomatic mission was devised. Someone needed to deliver an ultimatum directly to the French outposts. Dinwiddie entrusted this perilous mission to Major George Washington. Eager to prove himself, Washington accepted immediately. In late October 1753, he departed Williamsburg at the head of a small party of about 6 men, including a French-speaking interpreter, several seasoned woodsmen, and the renowned frontiersman Christopher Gist, who knew the terrain well and had strong ties with native communities. As they traveled deeper into the remote Ohio region, Washington stopped at the native village of Logstown on the Ohio River to meet local chiefs. He reminded them of their long-standing alliance with the British and explained his diplomatic mission. Tanacharison, the Seneca leader known as the half-king of the Iroquois, agreed to accompany Washington, bringing several warriors with him. With these allies guiding the way, Washington's party crossed forests and mountains, pressing onward until they reached the French post of Fort Le Boeuf, near present-day Lake Erie, in early December 1753. At Fort Le Boeuf, Washington was received politely by the French commander. He delivered Governor Dinwiddie's ultimatum, demanding that French forces withdraw from the Ohio region. The commander kept Washington for several days of formal exchanges before handing him a written reply addressed to the governor. The response was courteous in tone, but in essence, it firmly declined to leave the territory. With his diplomatic mission complete, Washington immediately set out on the arduous return journey. The trip back proved far more difficult than the journey out. By mid-December, heavy snow, bitter cold, and treacherous terrain blocked their progress at every turn. At one point, Washington and Gist decided to separate from the rest of the group and take a shortcut through the forest. While the 2 men were alone on a narrow path, they unexpectedly encountered a solitary native man who appeared hostile. Without warning, the stranger raised his firearm and fired at Washington from close range. The shot narrowly missed him. He nearly lost his life. In the split second that followed, Washington and Gist slipped into the darkness and escaped their attacker. After surviving this danger, they soon faced another challenge upon reaching the Allegheny River. The river in winter was icy, swift, and filled with drifting blocks of ice. There was no bridge or boat in sight. Washington and Gist used an axe they carried to cut down trees and lash together a crude raft. Fighting the freezing current, they attempted to pole their way across, pushing aside ice floes as they went. Halfway across, a large block of ice slammed into the raft. Washington lost his balance and was thrown into the frigid water. Struggling in the freezing current, he managed to cling to a floating piece of ice until Gist pulled him back aboard. Soaked and shivering, they abandoned the raft and waded through the icy river to a small island. They spent a harrowing night there, their clothes frozen stiff. At dawn, fortune returned. The river had frozen over completely. Exhausted, Washington and Gist walked across the solid ice to the opposite bank. Despite fatigue and hardship, Washington pressed on. He trekked hundreds of miles through snow-covered wilderness and returned to Williamsburg in January 1754. Carrying the French commander's letter and the detailed journal he had kept throughout the mission. Recognizing the value of this report, Governor Dinwiddie immediately published Washington's account. The tale of the young major's perilous journey captured the imagination of both the colonial public and readers in Britain. Very quickly, the name Washington became associated with bravery and youthful determination. But even as Washington was celebrated, the situation in the Ohio Valley worsened for the British. As the French commander had essentially stated, they not only refused to withdraw, but also strengthened their military presence. Early in 1754, French forces drove off a group of British workers who had begun building a small fort at the forks of the Ohio River, and they completed a strong defensive post there, Fort Duquesne, near present-day Pittsburgh. It was clear that France intended to hold the region. Governor Dinwiddie believed immediate action was necessary. In the spring of 1754, Dinwiddie ordered Washington to lead a militia force of about 150 men toward Fort Duquesne. Their mission was to support British interests in the Ohio Territory and, if possible, repel newly arrived French forces. Officially, Washington held the rank of lieutenant colonel and served under a British colonel. But during the march, the senior officer was fatally injured after falling from his horse. As a result, the 22-year-old George Washington suddenly became the acting commander of the Virginia forces. As they moved closer to Fort Duquesne, Washington received intelligence that a small detachment of French troops was traveling through the nearby forest, possibly to scout or ambush the British force. Washington decided to strike first. He set up camp at an open meadow called Great Meadows, then took about 40 soldiers and a group of native warriors led by Tanacharison to secretly approach the French encampment. At dawn, on the 28th of May, 1754, Washington and his men surrounded the French camp, hidden in a remote ravine. The French party, about 35 soldiers led by Lieutenant Joseph Jumonville, was completely taken by surprise. Washington ordered his men to open fire. The skirmish was brief, lasting roughly 15 minutes amid thick fog and the echo of gunfire rolling through the forest. In the end, around 10 French soldiers lost their lives, while the rest either fled or were captured. Jumonville himself was severely wounded in the opening volley. In the confusion that followed, Tanacharison rushed toward the injured French officer. One account claims he struck Jumonville with a hatchet as an act of vengeance against the French, with whom his people had long-standing grievances. Other sources suggest that a British soldier may have delivered the fatal shot after seeing Jumonville beside Washington. However the moment unfolded, Jumonville ultimately did not survive, and the entire French detachment was defeated. This was George Washington's first taste of battlefield success, and also the first time lives were lost under his command. The small victory at Great Meadows quickly ignited a much larger conflict, far beyond what the young officer had anticipated. Upon hearing news of the incident, the French reacted with fury. They insisted that Washington had ambushed a diplomatic mission engaged in peaceful negotiations, since Jumonville carried official correspondence from the French government. In Paris, the event was labeled the Jumonville Affair, and the French vowed retaliation. Washington soon realized the gravity of the situation. A far larger French force could arrive at any moment. He hurriedly ordered his men to construct a makeshift defensive structure at Great Meadows, which he named Fort Necessity, and sent urgent calls for reinforcements back to Virginia. Just as expected, in early July 1754, roughly 600 French soldiers and 100 native warriors, commanded by Louis Coulon de Villiers, Jumonville's brother, advanced and encircled Fort Necessity. Heavy rain drenched the battlefield for hours, flooding the trenches and soaking much of Washington's gunpowder, leaving it unusable. Washington's men, outnumbered, exhausted, and unable to fire effectively, struggled under continuous enemy fire. After about 9 hours of fighting, with rising casualties and nearly no ammunition left, Washington had no choice but to request negotiations. The French offered surprisingly lenient terms. The garrison would be allowed to withdraw safely if Washington signed a surrender document acknowledging responsibility for the assassinat of Jumonville. Unfamiliar with French legal terminology, Washington did not realize the word assassinat implied intentional murder. With no alternative to save his troops, he agreed. Though Washington later deeply regretted signing the document on the night of the 3rd of July, 1754, he and the surviving soldiers departed Fort Necessity with their dignity intact, carrying with them a harsh but invaluable lesson about the realities of war. The events at Great Meadows and Fort Necessity did not remain confined to the Virginia frontier. They ignited a large-scale colonial conflict between Britain and France. Neither side was willing to yield in North America. Early in 1755, the British government sent 2 regiments of regular troops to join colonial militias in driving the French out of the Ohio Valley. Thus began the French and Indian War, which lasted from 1754 to 1763, and ran parallel to the wider global conflict between Britain and France, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. As for Washington, after returning from Fort Necessity, he found himself in a difficult position. Because the British altered their rank structure, they refused to recognize his colonial commission as colonel, granted by Virginia, and insisted that he accept the lower rank of captain under British officers. Feeling insulted and undervalued, Washington resigned from the militia at the end of 1754 and withdrew to civilian life. However, Washington could not remain on the sidelines for long. In April 1755, a British expeditionary force commanded by General Edward Braddock arrived in Virginia to march on Fort Duquesne. Washington agreed to join the expedition as an informal aide-de-camp, given his knowledge of the terrain and prior experience in the region. By mid-1755, Braddock's army of more than 2,000 men advanced deep into the rugged hills of Pennsylvania. On the 9th of July, 1755, as they crossed the Monongahela River near Fort Duquesne, the British forces fell into a devastating ambush by a combined French and native force. Caught by surprise, the redcoat ranks collapsed into chaos, suffering heavy losses. General Braddock was fatally wounded, and many senior officers also did not survive. In the midst of the disaster, Washington demonstrated remarkable composure and courage. Riding across the battlefield on horseback, he rallied scattered troops into defensive groups and led them in an orderly retreat. Accounts later claimed that 2 horses were shot from under him, and his coat was pierced by multiple bullets, yet he remained unharmed. Thanks to Washington's leadership, much of the British force escaped the ambush and avoided complete destruction. After the battle, colonial newspapers praised him as one of the bravest young officers in the provinces. Not long after, the governor of Virginia persuaded Washington to return to military service. This time, Washington was commissioned as a colonel and appointed commander of the Virginia Regiment, responsible for defending hundreds of miles of frontier from French and native attacks. From 1755 to 1758, Washington was based primarily at Winchester, Virginia, continuously patrolling and building defensive forts along the Appalachian Mountains. Conditions were extremely difficult. Manpower was limited, supplies were scarce, and most of his soldiers were inexperienced recruits, lacking discipline, while enemy raiding parties launched swift and unpredictable attacks. Washington frequently expressed frustration in letters to the colonial government about inadequate support. Even so, he persevered, training his regiment, reducing raids, and providing a measure of safety to frontier settlers. During these years, Washington gained essential command experience, learning how to build an effective fighting force and how to coordinate operations with British regulars. The hardships of frontier warfare further forged the character of the young commander. By late 1758, the strategic balance had shifted decisively in Britain's favor. In November, British forces captured Fort Duquesne. The French destroyed the fort and withdrew, eliminating the primary threat in the Ohio region. After nearly 5 years of continuous military service, George Washington decided to retire from the Army and return to civilian life. He left the military in December 1758 at just 26 years old, in the esteem of a provincial hero. Soon after, in January 1759, Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow and substantial landowner. The marriage made Washington one of the wealthiest planters in Virginia and marked the beginning of a more stable chapter in his life. Settling at Mount Vernon, he closed the turbulent chapter of his youth and entered a new phase of maturity. Looking back on Washington's childhood and early adulthood, it is clear that every hardship and test he endured helped forge the character of a future statesman. From the fatherless boy who learned self-reliance, to the disciplined young man cultivating the manners of a gentleman, to the fearless frontier surveyor and the officer who first tasted the realities of war, each stage contributed to shaping Washington's resilience, responsibility, and ambition. The hard-won lessons of courage, failure, honor, and leadership he acquired in his 20s became invaluable as he later shouldered far greater responsibilities during the American Revolution. The life of George Washington reads like a vivid historical novel, and the opening chapters are the very years of storm and growth you have just followed. What do you think about the childhood and early experiences of George Washington? Did these difficult formative years help create the father of his country? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more compelling stories from history.